The first thing to say about the early 1980s is that things were different then. The main focus of attention was still the Cold War, the US-Soviet competition. Things were seen through that prism. Non-proliferation was a second-tier issue. It did not get the attention that it does today. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was only about 10 years old at the beginning of that decade, and the non-proliferation norm had not been fully established. Many countries had not yet signed on to the NPT, including France, China, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, even Spain in 1980 had not signed on. Those of us in the intelligence community working on non-proliferation issues were focused on what we sometimes called the dirty dozen. There were some familiar names on this list like India, Pakistan, Iraq, and also some other countries that we aren't as concerned about these days, such as Argentina, Brazil, and South Africa. In Asia, North Korea was not one of those countries. We were not focused on North Korea. Our concern in Asia was South Korea and Taiwan, because both of those countries in the mid-70s had inchoate nuclear weapons programs, largely as a result of concerns that they had about the nature of US security guarantees. The programs in those two countries were detected at a very early stage, and the US exerted a lot of pressure to turn those programs off. We did know that North Korea was interested in nuclear power, and that they had been talking to the Soviets about getting nuclear power reactors. The Soviets provided a research reactor to the North Koreans in the 1970s, established a nuclear research center at Yongbyon, and we were watching that research center. Around 1980, we noticed a new reactor under construction there, a second reactor in addition to the IRT research reactor that the Soviets had provided. By 1984, it took a few years until construction on that reactor had progressed to the stage that we could tell much about it. But by April 1984, it was clear that the reactor had a significant capability, would have a significant capacity to produce plutonium when it was completed. And so the intelligence community, we sent out a warning notice to policymakers, letting them know that a reactor was under construction at Yongbyon that represented a significant step towards a North Korean nuclear weapons capability. So now the North Korean program was on the scope. It was on the policymakers' list of issues to worry about. And the obvious thing to do, since we knew that they were talking to Moscow about power reactors, was to press the Soviet Union to insist that before they reached any agreement with North Korea about power reactors, that they get North Korea to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they had not done. During the Cold War, nuclear proliferation issues were one of those few topics that we pretty much saw eye to eye with the Soviets, and there was some cooperation. And in fact, they did press the North Koreans, and the North Koreans did sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in December 1985. 2 weeks later, they signed a contract with the North Koreans to provide power reactors. Of course, that never came to fruition. So this was the first time the problem was solved in 1995, or 1985, when the North Koreans signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was seen as a breakthrough. It suggested peaceful intent. Now again, this is an aspect of how thinking may have changed back in the 80s from what it is today. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they signed up to it, they're going to accept safeguards, the reactor is at a known site, so, and we knew the North Koreans were interested in nuclear power, so there were a lot of reasons to think initially that perhaps this reactor was for peaceful purposes. At least that's what the early IC assessments noted, that was a significant possibility. They also always noted the weapons potential. But the IC judgments in those early years were cautious about the actual purpose and did not immediately conclude that it was for nuclear weapons development. By 1987, there was a second large building under construction there that was suspected of being a reprocessing facility, a building where the spent fuel from the reactor would be processed, and the plutonium in that spent fuel, after having been irradiated in the reactor, would be separated. So that's a stage in producing plutonium after the fuel has been irradiated in the reactor. And there was uncertainty about the purpose of it, and there was some controversy about it, and this was taken a bit as a proxy about the purpose of the activity. The belief was that if this was a reprocessing facility for the purpose of separating plutonium, then it was more likely that this activity was weapons related. If it was not a reprocessing facility, then it was more likely peaceful. Now, I think there are some problems with that analysis, and I'll come back to that a little bit, but that was the tenor of much of the analysis at that time. So as the 80s go on, get to the late 80s, there was increasing concern, but policymakers were slow to take further action because there were not too many good options seen. When you sign the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, you're supposed to accept IAEA safeguards. You're supposed to declare your nuclear facilities and accept safeguards implemented by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. Well, the IAEA made a mistake. They sent the wrong forms to the North Koreans. You're supposed to make this declaration within 18 months. 18 months after the North Koreans joined the NPT, they still have not declared their facilities. The IAEA figures out they made a mistake. They send the correct forms. They reset the clock. Another 18 months passes. The North Koreans still make no declaration of their nuclear activities, do not accept safeguards. So we're now 3 years after December 1985, December 1988. There's the controversy about the reprocessing facility. People are getting increasingly concerned. But again, the policymakers are slow to take further action. What can we do? We press the Russians again, the Soviets, but the Soviets say, well, there's nothing we can do. We've tried. So that's where things stood at the end of 1998.